so what's the craziest pushback I can remember? Well, I wasn't actually there because while I was becoming a believer and learning about Jesus and all of this, I didn't actually get out and travel that much with him. So I remember him coming back from this trip to this city called Ephesus. All right, now think of going to a place where everybody there believes there is one God, not the God, but Artemis created everything there, is in charge of everything. All right, so they had statues and pictures and lots of idols to Artemis. And when Paul went in and started preaching about Jesus and about God's word, that was totally different. All right, so kind of to put this into context, think about your favorite team, right? And you go to one place where everybody in that city loves this team, and you're the one naysayer who says, oh no, your team, they don't have game. Let me tell you about my team. Or think of it, well, when he started preaching the word of Jesus, talking about God, think about all the people there who were so enraged. It was like they literally stormed the government capitol. All right, unannounced, just started breaking through the windows, trying to get to Paul, trying to find him, trying to drag him off. Well, he finally did escape to the outskirts of town. You know, he's regrouping with the disciples and then realized, wait a minute, I had some friends there. I've got to go back and save them. And this town is going nuts. And I'm not talking just TPing your neighbors, okay? They're going insane. Breaking statues, doing everything they can to find Paul and anyone who's following him and helping him. Well, Paul wants to go back into this mess to save his friends, and the disciples are like, whoa, hold on, come back. Let us get in there. They don't know us. We'll get in there. We'll help get them out. And you can live another day to tell another story of Jesus somewhere else. Now, when I think of crazy, and I'm not talking like in-laws at Thanksgiving drinking a little too much crazy, that was off the chain. And it's stories like that when he comes back tells me that there is power in the words that he's speaking. Okay, again.
If I flip it on, it's easier. Well, welcome, I'm Isaac. I'm glad you guys are here. When I was in the 9th grade, my family and I, we lived in the Bay Area of California. And my parents were kind enough to send me to a Christian basketball camp for a week, several hundred miles south in Thousand Oaks, California. And while we were there, while this basketball camp was going, simultaneously in the same facility was a football camp and a basketball camp, and they were teenagers everywhere. Teenage boys. It was a wild week. And while I was there was during one of the days, the Lakers head coach Randy Fund came to talk to us basketball players, and he showed us some moves, and afterwards we were able to get his autograph. And while he was there, the campers at the camp told the head coach of the Lakers, they said, this guy over here is the biggest fan in all of the camp of the Lakers. And they were talking about me. Now, I was a shy, awkward, marginal basketball player. How is it possible that I would be notified and all of these hundreds of kids in Thousand Oaks, California as the top Laker fan at the camp? At the time, I was mildly pleased with myself. As an adult, I think, I wonder if I had some priorities out of line that would cause me to be noticed that way. What did I bring with me? What kind of Laker gear did I bring to this camp? I don't remember, but I'm sure there was something. What was constantly on my mind? How did I get noticed of being the top Laker fan? I don't know. So when the Lakers would lose, it would painfully impact me. I was engrossed in the success or failure, which was rare, of the Lakers. See, the areas that draw my emotions and the areas where I spend my time, my money, my thought life, it's those areas that we actually worship. Our word worship comes from the idea of where we give our worth. Where are we putting our worth? That's what we worship. So if this is true, I assigned in my teenage years and probably trickling on a little later than that, my worth and worship to the Lakers. I found my identity, my hope, my joy in being a Laker fan. And I know there are a host of you out there shaking your head saying, why would you do that? I agree. Worshiping the Lakers isn't a good idea, even though we won way more championships than any of your fans. But I digress. See, what we worship is where we give our worth. We all serve something. And so while my identity was clear and obvious to people, we all do that. We all have areas where we say, this person probably worships that because that's where our time, our thoughts, our emotions, our money, that's what we end up worshiping. So we're nearing the end of our study on Paul, and we come to one of my favorite stories in his life. I think it's really interesting. This passage of Scripture, there are so many different directions that we can go and talk about with this passage. I'm going to really try to stay focused. And so when we're talking about Paul, though, in Ephesus, we find him here in the city called Ephesus. It's in Asia. I think we have a map of it. It's an incredibly wealthy area. It's strategic. Its location is, let's see if I can move clear over this direction. It's up here in the Mediterranean Sea, and it's on it's here so they can easy transport. It's a port city. It gets into this part of Asia. Europe's not far away. Rome's over there. It's an incredibly important city. And so Ephesus is wealthy. It's a seaport. And they also become famous for magic. So it's the third largest city in the Roman Empire, an estimated 250,000 people at the time Paul was there. It's known for having one of the 7 wonders of the world, the Temple of Artemis. Here's a picture of the Temple of Artemis. It was massive, and there are actually 2 different goddesses named Artemis. One was the Greek goddess Artemis. She was the goddess of hunt. And the Ephesians goddess of Artemis, she was the fertility, magic, and astrology goddess. And this was her primary place of worship. And so people would come from all over the world to look at and worship at the Temple of Artemis. The result of her prominence in Ephesus is that it becomes known. Ephesus is the capital for astrology, magic, that the idea of ports and seaports is a major city there. So it's a wealthy city. And she's also a fertility goddess. So you know what kind of sexual exploits happen in a place where they worship a goddess of love and fertility. So that's what's going on there. And Paul comes into this city. People travel from all over there. And when you travel to cities like this and you worship at these places, you end up buying images and bringing them home. Has any of you traveled to an Oregon coast city like Cannon Beach and you come home with the Cannon Beach sweatshirt? That's what we do, right? We travel, and wherever we go, we buy the mug. That's what happens in these kind of cities too, except it's not just a Cannon Beach sweatshirt and salt Laffy Taffy. It is, we come home with the goddess of Artemis, or we come home with a statue of the temple. And so the people there, they are bankers, they're port people, and sorcerers and magic, but there's a massive amount of people who gain their wealth by selling the wares to this goddess. Paul travels into this city, and he starts telling the news of Jesus. Now, if you guys are Bible readers, Acts 19 is an incredible chapter to read. There's all kinds of drama and intrigue. Right before the story that I'm talking about, there's this great story about 7 brothers who try to exorcise a demon of one guy, all in Ephesus. This happens in Ephesus. And this one guy literally beats the pants off of the 7 brothers that are trying to free him of this demon. Great. The Bible is worth reading. One guy beats up and they leave naked, heading home while they try to help this guy out. Anyway, that's right before our story. Read the Bible. Some great stories in there. That is immediately going on. And so Paul and his guys are doing some incredible work, telling people about Jesus. People's lives are getting saved. Ephesus is changing. And so then we get to our story. People are coming to know Jesus. And this is the first section I want to read, Acts 19, 18 through 20. It says, "Also, many of those who were now believers came, confessing and divulging their practices. And a number of those who had practiced magic arts brought their books together and burned them in the sight of all. And they counted the value of them and found it came to 50,000 pieces of silver. So the word of the Lord continued to increase and prevail mightily." I'm going to skip down just a couple of verses and read. This is the main section we're going to talk about today. Acts 19, 23 through 34. "About that time there arose no little disturbance concerning the way. For a man named Demetrius, a silversmith, who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought no little business to the craftsmen. These he gathered together with the workmen in similar trades and said, 'Men, you know that from this business we have our wealth. And you see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a great many people, saying that gods made with hands are not gods. And there is danger not only that this trade of ours may come into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis may be counted as nothing, and that she may even be deposed from her magnificence, she whom all Asia and the world worship.' When they heard this, they were enraged and were crying out, 'Great is Artemis of the Ephesians!' So the city was filled with confusion, and they rushed together into the theater, dragging with them Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians who were Paul's companions in travel. But when Paul wished to go in among the crowd, the disciples would not let him. And even some of the Asiarchs who were friends of his sent to him and were urging him not to venture into the theater. Now some cried out one thing, some another, for the assembly was in confusion. Most of them did not know why they had come together. Some of the crowd prompted Alexander, whom the Jews had put forward. And Alexander, motioning with his hand, wanted to make a defense to the crowd. But when he recognized that he was a Jew, for about 2 hours, they all cried out with one voice, 'Great is Artemis of the Ephesians.'" All right, so that's the section that we're talking about. There's this massive riot that happens. But in our first section of Scripture, what I really want us to notice is the response of those who follow Christ, what they do. We're going to come back to that in a few minutes. But we see that they take what they have and they throw it in a fire. I just think that's interesting. We're going to talk about that at the very end. But when we get to the other people of the Ephesians, Luke tells us, Luke wrote Acts, that he says one of my favorite lines in this section. He says, "About that time there arose no little disturbance concerning the way." Remember from several weeks ago I mentioned that the term "the way" was how people describe those who follow Jesus, that we are on the way. They followed the way of Jesus. The way that they lived their lives looked considerably different than the way that those who don't follow Jesus live their lives. So the way that people who follow Jesus, we just live differently. So it's called the way. It's the way of Jesus. It's noticeable. And the followers of Jesus were making such an impact on the people of Ephesus that the city got angry at those people who were following Jesus. They were furious with the believers. And I just want to make a couple of comments about that. This gives me great encouragement that God's people can make a significant difference in the midst of culture. Sometimes we can just get so discouraged about what's going on around us. We look around and say, "Where is Jesus? What's happening?" Well, when the people of Jesus rise up and start following Jesus, become submitted to him, do the way of him, the city notices. It makes a difference in the world around us. It was making an impact, so much so that the people who it negatively impacted got angry. And so I see here a group of people who in a culture completely against God begin to see change occur. This gives me hope. This gives me hope that we gathering in this group and gathering all throughout our city of Spokane Valley and in this area, when we start to follow Jesus, we can make a difference in the people around us. I also noticed, though, that there were a massive amount of people in the community not excited about this change. This change would cause them to lose a lot of money. They weren't excited about having their work lessened. They were comfortable. They liked their lifestyle. They liked the way they live. They didn't want people coming in telling them to live differently. They didn't want people coming in to say they were living wrong. They were just fine with the way life was. And if you have followed Jesus and have found resistance from family members or friends, this is unfortunately a part of the process. Not everyone that we will encounter will want their life changed to follow Jesus. Many people in our community are just fine. They don't want to have to submit. They don't want to have to turn over their life. They're happy with their lifestyle. And they're not going to be excited about the news that we bring. And so there will be times where there will be contention when we encounter those from our community. Several times I've tried to follow Jesus only to be told that they didn't want to be any part of what I was talking about. Things like telling the truth, being loving, being honest aren't always well received. And I know there are stories here in our group of people who've done the same thing, and you haven't been well received when you've tried to bring Jesus into your workplaces and families. Now, let's be honest. Christians can absolutely be jerks and make it difficult for those to follow Jesus. But that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm not talking about that. Rather, this is when we are trying to stand up and live differently. We are trying to live the way of Christ. We will find enemies in our community. This is to be expected. And the message of Paul and his fellow companions that stirs up the people of Ephesus because their message goes directly against Artemis and the worship of her and her ideas. We actually saw what Paul's message was last week when we looked at the city of Athens. When Paul would come into a city, he would preach this. It says this in Acts 17, 24 through 25. Paul says, "The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he gives himself to all mankind life and breath and everything. Being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of man." Paul's message here is that God is not formed by humans. He's not made of silver or gold. We can't fashion an image out of him. So that goes directly against Demetrius' job. It goes directly against what the people of Ephesus are proud of. So this is a contrasting message. And Paul gets this lesson from the Ten Commandments. We get the first two. I'll read the first two. The first one is, "You shall have no other gods before me." So already Paul is coming in conflict with the people of Ephesus who worship Artemis. And the second one is, "You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth." Well, why is this such a big deal? Why is worshiping God such a problem? Or why is making an image of God such an issue? We like to be able to touch things. We're natural people. We like to see, taste, smell, look at things. What's the problem? Well, the reason goes back to the first commandment, right? If we start creating images, we're going to imagine God to be things that we look at or want to see. So that's why we have gods like Zeus and Baal or Artemis, and we create them how we think they should be. So it actually goes back to that first commandment where we start to worship other gods when we start creating things. We substitute those gods for the one true God. The other problem that is really important and I think often overlooked is that God has already made an image of himself here on earth. Genesis 1:27 says this, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them." That word image is the Hebrew root salem. It means statue, likeness, idol, replica. God has already made an image of himself. We are the image of God. We are made in his image. And so we are supposed to be God's representation on earth. Wherever we go, we should be bringing the things of God: love, joy, peace, grace, kindness. So we are God's replication. Wherever we go, we have that. So instead, what happens though is humans, we're distorted. We twist things. So we take ourselves and we think, oh, I want to create my own image. Because we have been twisted because of sin, we're now created twisted images. The whole thing gets really messed up. What should happen is when we see humans, if we want to see what does the image of God look like, that image of God is around us. We as Christ followers represent that. And so we don't need to make or fashion anything. That's us. What a beautiful idea that we have. What would you rather have? A statue or a friend? Statues are great and all. They're really nice to put on a shelf and hold down some papers. But what is even greater than that is a friend. Somebody who can help me in my time of need. Somebody who can give me a hug or smile at me or go play pickleball with. Whatever that is much better than a statue. And so we represent that. And so to begin to create images is a disgusting, distorted view of what God has intended for us. And we've really messed that up. And then we start creating it in our own images. And so we're really twisting these ideas of God. So in Ephesus, they have emphasized the worship of this fertility goddess. They emphasize all these things. They're rooting for and praying for crops to come and their animals to have lots of babies so that they can have lots of things. And Paul comes and he says to this town that this goddess is not the true God. And what they're doing, what they're worshiping is actually harmful. Well, this causes, as Luke writes, no little disturbance in Ephesus. Well, here's Demetrius. He's a silversmith. He makes a nice living doing this job. He's quite content with people coming into Ephesus, buying his statues of Artemis in the temple, and he looks like he's some kind of leader in this group because he's able to stir up the crowd. He's noticing, though, that as these Christians are starting to make an impact, his money is starting to dwindle. The amount of finances that he had, he's not as wealthy as he was because these Christians are stopping worshiping Artemis and are beginning to worship this other god. It's costing him money. Imagine a company that is flourishing, selling a product that worships wealth, sex, power, instant gratification. Can you think of any? Now imagine that Christians say, that following that company, whatever that is, I don't want to name anything because I'm just not in the mood to get political up here, but imagine what another company Christians say, that actually doesn't help me worship Jesus. I'm going to stop watching, buying, participating in that because that just doesn't help me in my worship. What would happen if Christians said, that's not helpful for us to worship, let's stop doing that? Can you imagine what these companies would start doing if we did that? They would start scrambling. They would probably produce different things. They would meet different needs. That's what happened in Ephesus. And so Demetrius sees the situation. He's losing money. He starts to stir up his friends and co-workers. Eventually, he persuades the city of Ephesus, and they end up in a riot. Chaos reigns. And the scene is a little easier for us to imagine than a couple of years ago. We've seen cities in turmoil. We've seen what happens when people get angry about some of the things that aren't going well. It becomes very fearful, very unsafe, and things can be destroyed. That's what's going on in the city of Ephesus. The crowd eventually grabs a couple of Paul's friends and drag them downtown Ephesus and put them in front of the city. The scene is ugly and it was violent. And I want us to notice the words that Demetrius uses to stir up the crowd. He says, in verse 25, men, you know that from this business we have our wealth. And let's skip down to verse 27. And there is danger not only that this trade of ours may come into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis may be counted as nothing, and that she may even be deposed from her magnificence, she whom all Asia and the world worship. Demetrius highlights 4 areas that capture the hearts of Ephesus to turn them against the followers of Jesus. I'm going to list these 4 and see if they might sound familiar to us. He talks about wealth or money. He talks about jobs or their significance in life. He talks about civil pride, how we're the Ephesians. So he's talking about politics. And he's also talking about religion, the way that they worship. Has anybody had any stories recently about wealth, jobs, politics, or religion? How about we gather around the Thanksgiving table and start with these topics, huh? We know that if you capture that in a person, you know that we get really emotional about that. Those are the things that really set our world off. And Demetrius uses those 4 areas to grab people and to take them away and to stir up the city. Now, we don't worship Artemis in our culture. But I do think that those 4 ideas are pretty common things that we actually do worship. I think we do worship those things in a variety of different ways. I'm reminded of the words of God to the prophet Ezekiel. God said this in Ezekiel 14, 2 and 3. It says, "And the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel. Son of man, these men have taken their idols into their hearts and set the stumbling block of their iniquity before their faces." See, idol worship, the worshiping of wealth or jobs or civic pride or religion, it's not just what happens out here, but it's actually what exposes what's going on inside of our hearts. What's going on inside of us takes place out there, and the result is worshiping these other things. We all worship something. And we worship money or material possessions. We worship our local sports teams or our politics or our nation. We worship the way we worship rather than the one that we worship. John Calvin, the 16th century church reformer and incredible church leader, he once said, "Man's nature is a perpetual factory of idols." He says that our heart, we're just constantly making up things to worship other things besides God. And I don't know if you find that in our place, where we're constantly replacing God with things that we can control. Now, we might look down at the Ephesians because they created an idol of something and would carry it around, and that's just not what we do anymore. We may mock them for that. But when we look at the words of Demetrius, we see that he actually is stirring something in us that we all can agree with. We do worship wealth. Look around us. We have an abundance. Even in our difficult economic climate right now, we have so many things. I recently read that most people in the history of the world never had more than 4 pairs of socks at any time. Do you have more than 4 pairs of socks? That's considered in the scheme of the world pretty abundant. We can go down. I read that and went, whoa, that is remarkable. 4 socks. We have a lot. We're going to the grocery store and we say, oh, I only have 14 choices of deodorant. What's going on around here? Again, and this is our hard times, but we have in our world a climate of abundance. In Demetrius' words, they point us to a really important reality, and that is finances and worship are always intertwined. Where we spend our money is what we actually worship. And so once his bottom line started to dip, then he started to pay attention. Once the prices of gas and eggs started to climb, then we started to dip. I actually noticed here, when I started writing this, I didn't have $5. I thought $5 was going to be a high amount when I started, and then I woke up and I was looking through this morning and went, oh, $5, that was so 4 days ago. We've blown past that, right? When our money starts to get impacted, then we start paying attention. Do you know what you worship? Let's look at where you spend your money. Where your money is, there your heart will be also. And this might seem harsh, but I'm going to say it. I do have several friends who constantly complain about it not having enough money. And yet, they have all of the nice toys. They have all of the newest technology. They're constantly going away on vacation. And yet, money is the biggest stress in their life. You can live a little simpler. What are we actually worshiping? Finances and worship are always connected. Now, all of those toys are great, and they are an incredible gift. But do they become our God? What about your job? I know an incalculable amount of people who define their life by their job, by what they do. Maybe you're a pastor or a teacher. Pastors are really good at making sure that their identity is wrapped around our job. It's what happens to all of us. Our job becomes more important than our spouses or our kids or our own health. We serve our job like it is our God. Maybe feeling like a success is so important to you that it overcomes and overwhelms your life. We get so busy with doing our job and making sure that we've done great at it, been successful, that it actually takes over and consumes every single element of our day. Our job can become a god, and I think Demetrius highlights that. The next one that Demetrius mentions is civic pride. This can look like pride in your city, being proud of your state or your nation, all of these ways, or being proud of your sports team. I think that's the easiest way for us to kind of grasp that. One thing that I can think of is I used to live in Eugene, Oregon, and on college game day when the Oregon Ducks play football, you might as well forget driving down I-5. It's from Portland to Eugene, that's a 2-hour ride. It is packed bumper to bumper the whole way down. And there are 50,000 people dressed and cheering, and it's an incredible worship service. People passionately serve that God. And that's a way that we have civic pride, where that can go too far, where we worship something that we are proud of in our local areas, but is not God. We here in the Spokane area, we have Gonzaga and WSU. We can be proud of that, but those are poor substitutes for God. Well, how do you know if you've made your politics or your civic area God? Well, again, what do you find yourself listening to? Are you listening more to political news outlets or to worship music? Do you find yourself reading more on CNN and Fox News or from the Gospels? Do you find that your conversations are more about our country's situation, or is it about the hope we have in Christ? If we start examining where we're putting our thoughts and conversations and time and money, we start to begin to see where our God is. Finally, Demetrius used the practice of worship, so worship practices of Artemis, to draw the people's hearts away from God. So we can begin to place our practices, the way that we do worship, on towards God instead of actually worshiping God. So if we start saying, we need to be at church, we're going to be there, and we aren't outside of church still working on grace and forgiveness and kindness, well, then that becomes a problem. So there are countless stories of people whose father made them at church on a Sunday morning, but who during the rest of the week was abusive, a drunk, neglectful. And their story is, I had to be at church on Sunday, but at home it was brutal. Well, that's making the practices of worship more important than actually worshiping God. And we can do that quite often. There is a pastor named Timothy Keller. He wrote a book called Counterfeit Gods, which is a great book. Check it out. It's where I borrowed the title from of the sermon. He says that an idol is anything that is more important to you than God. And he went on to say that counterfeit gods always disappoint and often destructively. When we put other things, our jobs, money, possessions, the way we worship, when we put those things in place of God, it is always disappointing and oftentimes destructively. There's another modern-day pastor named John Mark Comer, and he was talking about the goddess of love and specifically sex in another part of the gospel, and he said that we see this today. He says that we see the worship of love and sex in the CEO of multi-billion-dollar global industry. Entertainment, television, marketing, porn, strip clubs, fashion, cosmetics, health, fitness, plastic surgery, Botox, Viagra. Her temple is ubiquitous. And this is what he continues. And she is not easy to please. She demands we make sacrifices. We have to give up our innocence, our purity, often our body's well-being, and of course, our freedom. Because when we turn sex into a god, it becomes a cruel tyrant. What is supposed to function as a gift for us to enjoy becomes an addiction with a strange, otherworldly power over us. What John Mark Comer's talking about, he's not just talking about that particular God, but all gods. When we worship any idol, any false god, they all take away our freedom. They all consume us completely. And instead of we think, this is going to set me free by doing all of these things, actually what they do is they cause enslavement. When we serve other gods that aren't true, we become addicted. We find ourselves bound up in shame, in regret, in the longing for the next thing. We're constantly on the search for more, and nothing seems to satisfy. And they end up bringing destruction and pain. And so, for example, let's take the city of Ephesus. A riot is caused because they worship Artemis. Chaos reigned. Confusion and anger and frustration boils over. But I want to go back to that first group of people that we read about in verse 19. Where it says, and a number of those who'd practiced magic arts brought their books together and burned them in the sight of all. And they counted the value of them and found it came to 50,000 pieces of silver. Notice how the Christ followers respond to the work of Jesus in their lives. They take their old way of life and completely get rid of it. They gather up their old aspects that help them worship their false goddess Artemis. They gather up those old idols and whatever it was that consumed them, and they literally throw it in the fire. They brought their scrolls filled with witchcraft. They brought those temple images made of silver. They could have sold this for a lot of money. It says that they had 50,000 pieces of silver. And what Luke is talking about there, he's actually talking about the pieces of silver was a day's wage. So that's 50,000 days of wages worth. That's millions of dollars. And they throw it in the fire and let it burn. Why would they do that? Well, they were letting go of what they had previously treasured in their life. If they treasured power and influence through witchcraft and sorcery and astrology, it's gone. If they treasured political ties by being important in the city of Ephesus, well, now the city of Ephesus hates them and is trying to get rid of them. That's now gone. If they treasured their work as witchcraft and sorcerers, they valued that as who they were, it was gone. If they valued money, they could have sold that for a lot of money. All of that was gone. They set all that they were tied to on fire. What we notice is that following Jesus actually sets us free. We notice that false gods enslave while Jesus frees. When we give our life to Jesus, we understand that the riches of this world cannot compare to the glory of following him. The riches of this world are like that statue that somebody worships versus a friend. Just a poor comparison. I can have a picture of my daughter, but she's not going to talk back to me in a loving way. We want the real person. And these false gods, they bring slavery and bondage, but Jesus brings freedom. It is such a difference in what he brings. And so wealth and work, politics, influence, love, sex, and religion, doing the practices of worship, do not compare to the joy that Jesus brings when we follow him. Think about those lifestyles of the people in Ephesus who gave their life to Jesus. They were heavily involved in the occult. They were likely involved in the sex trade. Many made idols like Demetrius. What happens to your soul when you do that? And they said, enough of that. And they gave their life to Jesus, and he welcomed them in. See, no matter what our past looks like, Jesus brings grace, forgiveness, freedom. He welcomes us. Some of us may not be proud of the areas that we used to be involved in, or some of the things that we're currently doing. We can't seem to stop. But we recognize that worshiping Jesus, we can lay all of that down and he will say yes to us. When we worship Jesus, we lay those at the feet and he offers forgiveness. He brings freedom. He brings peace. We're constantly feeling regret of, I did it again. Jesus' love overcomes all of that. So we have looked to other places to find fulfillment rather than Jesus. We can recognize today that when we worship Jesus, we have freedom. So no matter what you've done, no matter what you're doing, Jesus will accept you. We were all created to worship. We were all created to worship him, and sometimes we just get a little off track. And that's why Jesus came, to draw us back to him. So Jesus offers us new life. He breaks the bonds of freedom, or breaks the bond of our past, and sets us free from shame and regret. He takes away the insecurities. He sets us free from addictions. When we understand this, our response to Jesus is then to give him back the worth, or to worship him for what he's done. Our hearts and minds and our bodies are drawn to him rather than to these false gods. So this morning, I want to invite you to examine your life. Where in your life have you begun to prioritize things that don't line up with God? Where have you started to find your comfort, your identity, your reputation, and put that ahead of Jesus? See, this only leads to strife and anxiety and worry, only leads to pain and destruction, while the way of Jesus leads to life. And as Jesus says, to the life more abundant. It leads to grace and forgiveness. This morning, what we're going to do, we have just a couple minutes left. We're going to conclude with communion so we can take out our communion pieces. And this is a reminder. This is an act of worship. We are looking back at what Jesus did. and how in just a moment we're going to take the bread and we're going to break the bread. And it's a reminder to us that Jesus' body was broken. He was beaten and battered for our sake. And he did that so that we can be whole again, so that we can have life in him. And it's a reminder to us when we break this bread that he was broken on our behalf and we no longer have to be. But he did that for our sake. So let's go ahead and break the bread together. And then we can peel back the top part for our juice. And the juice is a reminder of the blood that Jesus gave. And blood is a reminder of life. Jesus gave his life for ours. And so we can have new life. Some of us are going through some tough things. We're discouraged. We're lonely. We feel like our lives are getting sucked out of us because our finances aren't there or family problems. But when we look at this, we're reminded that we have hope in the life of Jesus who gave us life. And now today we can, as Kimber said earlier today, we will never taste death because we have him. And so this morning, we drink this as an act of worship, ascribing to Jesus the life that he gave and the love that he gave us when he shed his blood on the cross. Let's drink together. Let's pray. Jesus, you gave us life, and we have done a host of things that puts other gods in place of you. And as we're reminded by Demetrius in his words, they never satisfy. Those areas, they distract us and they cause us pain. But God, you give us joy and hope and grace. And I know, Lord, there are people here this morning that need to experience that. They're going through tough times. And God, will you just give them your great presence, your love, and your mercy? Draw us closer to you, Lord, so that we can find life in you. Yes. We thank you for your work and that you are always by our side. In your name, amen. We like to leave here with a couple of questions to talk about. So you can go home with your small groups, your family members, to just talk about this, help bring to mind what we talked about today. The first one is, what makes us uncomfortable, angry, or anxious? So when we notice that, we start to decide, that helps us know what actually caused us to worship, what areas of our worship. So for me, being late causes me a tremendous amount of anxiety. Well, why? What about that? Is that a control problem? What's going on with that? So you start uncovering that. That's going to point to you what your area of worship actually is instead of Jesus. The second question then is, what has Jesus done for you? So my hope in asking that question is then for you to notice what your emotions are as you begin to talk about it. Do you say, oh man, he gave me the most incredible family? And as we talk about what Jesus has done, I think that act begins to move us towards worship. And so I want us to notice what sometimes we worship, and then hopefully by talking about what Jesus has done, we actually move towards worship as we talk with our friends and family. We do end with a prayer of blessing, and so let me give you the prayer of blessing as we leave. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Intersection, go in peace. Have a great week. Thanks for being here this morning.